What was the French and Indian War?
The French and Indian War, 1754–63, was the last major conflict in North America before the Revolutionary War, 1775–83. During colonial times, both Britain and France had steadily expanded their territories into the Ohio River Valley. Since the fur trade prospered in this region, both countries wished to control it. But as the French encroached on their territory, the British colonists sent an ultimatum to them. This message was delivered by none other than George Washington. 1732–1799, who had been sent by the British governor. But the French made it clear that they did not intend to back down. So in 1754 Washington, now a lieutenant colonel, and 150 troops established a British outpost at present-day Pittsburgh, not far from where the French had installed themselves at Fort Duquesne. That spring and summer fighting broke out. Washington met the French, and though he and his troops mustered a strong resistance, there were early losses for the British. But a reinvigorated British force, under the leadership of Britain's Secretary of State William Pitt, 1759–1806, took French forts along the Allegheny River in western Pennsylvania and met French troops in battle at Quebec. In 1755 Washington was made colonel and led the Virginia troops in defending the frontier from French and Indian attacks. Though the British finally succeeded in occupying Fort Duquesne in 1758, at which time Washington temporarily retired to his farm in Virginia, fighting continued until 1763 when the Treaty of Paris ended the war. The British won the spoils, gaining control of all French lands in Canada as well as French territories east of the Mississippi River, with the exception of New Orleans. The city was ceded to Spain, along with its holdings west of the Mississippi. Spain had become an ally to France late in the war. In 1762, in exchange for Havana, Cuba, Spain turned over Florida to the British. France, which had once controlled a vast region of America, retained only two small islands off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, and the two Caribbean islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe.
Why was the election of Vicente Fox a landmark?
The July 2000 election of businessman-turned-politician Vicente Fox, 1942, was monumental in Mexico's political history because it ousted the Institutional Revolutionary Party (PRI) that had ruled the nation for 71 years. It was a victory not only for Fox but for his National Action Party, PAN. The former Coca-Cola Company executive had turned to politics in the 1980s. Following a highly successful career in business, in 1987 Fox was elected to the National Chamber of Deputies, and in 1995 he was voted in as governor of his home state of Guanajuato. He promised voters economic and political reform, with a particular emphasis on ridding the nation's government of seemingly endemic corruption. Fox was sworn into office on December 1, 2000, for a 6-year term. In 2003 midterm elections, Fox's PAN party lost ground to the PRI.
What did Manifest Destiny have to do with the expansion of the United States?
The doctrine of manifest destiny emerged in the United States in the early 1800s and by the 1840s had taken firm hold. Adherents believed that Americans had a God-given right and duty to expand their territory and influence throughout North America. Manifest destiny was a rallying cry for expansionism and prompted rapid U.S. acquisition of territory during the 1800s. The acquisitions began in 1803 with the purchase of Louisiana Territory from France. In 1819 Florida and the southern strip of Alabama and Mississippi, collectively called the Old Southwest, were acquired from Spain in the Adams-Nice Treaty. In 1845 Texas was annexed after white settlers fought for and declared freedom from Mexico, forming the Republic of Texas and petitioning the Union for statehood. In 1846 the western border between Canada and the United States was determined to lie at 49 degrees north latitude, the northern boundary of what is today Washington State, in 1848 by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The United States secured New Mexico and California after winning the Mexican War. 1846–48, and in 1853 southern Arizona was acquired from Mexico in the Gadsden Purchase. With the 1853 agreement the United States had completed the acquisition of territory that makes up the contiguous states. The expansionist doctrine of manifest destiny was again invoked as justification for the Spanish-American War. 1898, which was fought over the issue of freeing Cuba from Spain. Spain lost the war, dissolving its empire. Cuba achieved independence, though it was occupied by U.S. troops for 3 years. By the close of the 19th century, manifest destiny had resulted in U.S. acquisition of the outlying territories of Alaska, Hawaiian Islands, Midway Islands, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, Wake Island, American Samoa, Panama Canal Zone, and U.S. Virgin Islands.
Who were the Romanovs?
The Romanov family ruled Russia from 1613 until 1917, when Nicholas II, 1868–1918, was overthrown by the Russian Revolution, 1905–17. The dynasty was established by Michael Romanov, grandnephew to Ivan the Terrible, who ruled from 1533 to 1584. There were 18 Romanov rulers, including the much-studied Peter the Great, who ruled from 1682 to 1725, and Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796. As the last Tsar of Russia. Nicholas II, who ruled from 1894 to 1917, likely suffered not only the recrimination that was due him, but the public hostility that had accumulated over centuries of ruthless Romanov leadership. Nicholas's difficulties came to a head when he got Russia involved in World War I, 1914-18. Which produced serious hardships for the Russian people and for which there was little public support. Once Tsar Nicholas was overthrown, and later killed, in the Russian Revolution. 1905-17, Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin, 1870-1924. Set about extracting Russia from the conflict by agreeing to sever concessions to Germany. Oddly enough, the Romanov family had, in the 14th century, originated with a German nobleman, Andrew Kabila, who had emigrated to Russia.
What is the world's tallest building?
The honor belongs, at least for a time, to Taipei 101, also known as Taipei Financial Center, in Taiwan. The soaring spire, which rises to a height of 1,670 feet and includes 101 stories, was completed in 2004, besting Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia's twin Petronas Towers, completed in 1998, which measure 1,483 feet and 88 stories. For 6 years, the Petronas laid claim to the title of world's tallest building. The next tallest is the Sears Tower, completed in 1974, which rises 1,450 feet and 110 stories above Chicago's sidewalks. For a time, it, too, was the world's tallest. The skyscraper is a decidedly American contribution to world architecture. When Chicago rebuilt following the Great Fire of October 1871, a new brand of architecture emerged, which focused on commercial buildings. Architects of the so-called Chicago School used new building materials and the innovative elevator, first patented by Elisha Otis in 1861, to construct vertical office buildings, making the most of city real estate. Though many designers worked on the form, engineer/architect William Jenney, 1832-1907, is called the father of the skyscraper. His home insurance building, completed in 1885, it was demolished in 1931. Rose to 10 stories and used mass-produced steel beams, cast iron, and wrought iron with masonry walls. Soon Chicago's and New York's skylines were punctuated by rising towers. By the end of the 19th century, the race for tallest was on. New York's Park Row building, which still stands today in Lower Manhattan, was completed in 1899 and rises to a height of 386 feet and 30 stories. The 20th century saw the skyscraper reach ever upward. For a short time, the title of world's tallest building was held by Manhattan's celebrated Chrysler Building. Completed in 1930, considered the height of Art Deco design. The Chrysler's 1,046 feet and 77 stories of glory were soon bettered by the Empire State Building. Completed in 1931, which boasts a total height of 1,224 feet and 102 stories. That New York City landmark held onto its position for 4 decades, becoming second tallest with the 1973 completion of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, which soared to 1,368 and 1,362 feet, and 110 stories each, before they fell in the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Despite the fear that skyscrapers, bold symbols of capitalism, could become targets for other terrorist strikes, architects and developers continued to reach skyward, assuring that Taipei 101 would be surpassed.
What was the first national government?
It is believed to have been that of the first Egyptian king, Menes, who united Upper and Lower Egypt in 3110 B.C. and founded a central government at Memphis, near present-day Cairo. Ruling for 62 years, Menes established the first of what would eventually number 30 dynasties that ruled ancient Egypt for nearly 3,000 years until 332 BC. By the time the third dynasty began around 2700 BC, the central government was well established, and strong subjects believed their kings and queens to be half human and half god. The pharaohs lived in magnificent luxury. Palaces and temples were built for them and were filled with exotic goods from other lands. These treasures were even buried with the pharaohs in order to be enjoyed in the afterworld. It was during the Third Dynasty that the 500-year period known as the Old Kingdom or the Pyramid Age began. It would become the period that saw the building of gigantic pyramids for Egypt's kings.
Of the great trio of high Renaissance artists Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael, who is considered the master?
Most historians and critics agree that it was Raphael Sanzio. 1483 to 1520, who most clearly stated the ideals of the High Renaissance. Though arch-rivals Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519, and Michelangelo Buonarroti, 1475 to 1564, influenced the younger Raphael, he developed his own style. A prolific painter, he was also a great technician whose work is characterized by a seemingly effortless grace. His most well-known work is the School of Athens, 1509 to 11. Which has been called a complete statement of the High Renaissance in its artistic form and spiritual meaning. The painting, which projects a stage-like space onto a two-dimensional surface, reconvenes the great minds of the ancient world: Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Diogenes, Euclid, for an exchange of ideas. Raphael even included himself in this gathering of greatness. but it seems only appropriate for the master to be in such company, in this work. Raphael has achieved the art of perspective, bringing the discipline of mathematics to pictorial space where human figures appear to move naturally.
Why is Paul Revere's ride so well known?
The April 18, 1775, event was famous in its own right but was memorialized by American writer Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. 1807 to 1882, in his poem, Paul Revere's Ride. The verse contains an error, or perhaps Longfellow simply took literary license. About the night that the American Revolution, 1775 to 83, began, the light signal that was to be flashed from Boston's Old North Church. One light if the British were approaching the Patriots by land and two if the approach was by sea. Was sent not to Revere, it was received by Revere's compatriots in Charlestown, now part of Boston proper. However, Revere did ride that night on a borrowed horse. He left Boston at about 10 p.m. and arrived in Lexington at midnight to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were wanted for treason, that the British were coming. The next day, April 19, the battles of Lexington and Concord were fought, starting the Revolutionary War in America. As an American patriot, Revere, 1735 to 1818, was known for his service as a special messenger. So much so that by 1773 he had already been mentioned in London newspapers. Revere also participated in the Boston Tea Party in 1773.
When was poker invented?
The card game, in which a player bets that the value of his or her hand is higher than those held by the other players, was invented in the 1820s by sailors in New Orleans. The sailors combined the ancient Persian game as NAS with the French game POC, which itself was a derivation of the Italian game Primera, and a cousin of the English game Brag. Poker was originally played with 3 cards from a deck of only 32 and included combinations such as pairs and 3 of a kind. The game was later played with 5 cards from a deck of 52 cards, and the draw was also added. Stud poker, where each player is dealt their first card face down and the next 4 cards face up, didn't come into existence for many years, until about 1864. Other later additions to the game were the straight, a hand consisting of 5 cards in sequence but not of the same suit, and the flush, a hand consisting of 5 cards of the same suit but not in sequence.
What were the deadliest volcanic eruptions in history?
The April 5, 1815, eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia was the deadliest yet, killing some 92,000 people. Another Indonesian eruption later in the 19th century, this time at Krakatau, claimed 36,417 lives in late August 1883. On the French island of Martinique in the West Indies, Mount Pelee erupted on August 30, 1902, and more than 29,000 people perished. A relatively recent and deadly eruption was that on November 13, 1985, at Nevada del Ruiz, Colombia. It claimed 23,000 lives. Iceland's Skaptur volcano erupted in 1783. While the number of lives lost may not qualify it for inclusion on a short list of deadliest volcanoes, the human toll was great indeed. 20% of the country's population died. Because of population growth, today more people live closer to volcanoes, both active and inactive. As a result, the number of volcano-related deaths has increased. Between the years 1600 and 1900, the estimated average death toll per year due to volcanoes was 315. Since the beginning of the 20th century, an average of 845 people have died each year because of volcanic eruptions.
When was London's Westminster Abbey built?
The famed National Church of England was begun between 1042 and 1065 when Edward the Confessor, c. 1003 to 1066, built a church on the site of the abbey. King Henry III, 1207 to 1272, began work on the main part of Westminster in 1245. Since the time of William the Conqueror, 1066, all of England's rulers, except Edward V and Edward VIII, have been crowned at the church. The abbey is also a burial place of great English statesmen and literary giants. The latter are buried in the Poets' Corner.
How old is Standard Time?
Standard Time was introduced in 1884, it was the outcome of an international conference held in Washington, D.C., to consider a worldwide system of time. By international agreement, Earth was divided into 24 different standard time zones. Within each time zone, all clocks are to be set to the same time. The device of standardized time zones was necessitated by the expansion of industry, businesses, particularly those in the transportation industry, could not coordinate schedules when each community used its own solar time. The local time as determined by the position of the sun. Railroad schedules had been extremely complicated before the establishment of standard time zones, which the railroads readily adopted. Each time zone spans 15 degrees of longitude, beginning at 0 longitude, called the prime meridian, which passes through the observatory at Greenwich, a borough of London, England. Time kept at the observatory is called Greenwich Mean Time, GMT. Time zones are described by their distance east or west of Greenwich. The model also dictates that each time zone is 1 hour apart from the next. However, the borders of the time zones have been adjusted throughout the world to accommodate national, state, and provincial boundaries. The contiguous United States has 4 time zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. Waters off the eastern seaboard are in the Atlantic time zone. Alaska, Hawaii, Samoa, Wake Island, and Guam each have their own time zones. Congress gave the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, authority to establish limits for U.S. time zones in 1918. This authority was transferred to the Department of Transportation, DOT, in 1967.
Who invented the steam engine?
Like many other modern inventions, the steam engine had a long evolution. It was first conceived of by Greek scientist Hero of Alexandria in the 1st century AD. The mathematician invented many contrivances that were operated by water, steam, or compressed air. These included not only a fountain and a fire engine, but the steam engine. Many centuries later, Englishman Thomas Newcomen (1663 to 1729) developed an early steam engine, about 1711, that was used to pump water. He was improving on a previous design, which had been patented by another inventor in 1698. But it was Scottish inventor James Watt, 1736 to 1819, who substantially improved Newcomen's machine, patenting his own steam-powered engine in 1769. It was the first practical steam engine, and Watt's many improvements to the earlier technology paved the way for the use of the engine in manufacturing and transportation during the Industrial Revolution. C. 1750 c. 1850, Britain was just on the cusp of this new age when Watt patented his engine. The steam engine was eventually replaced by more efficient devices such as the turbine. Developed in the 1800s, the electric motor, also developed in the 1800s, the internal combustion engine. First practical engine built in 1860, and the diesel engine, patented 1892. Nevertheless, James Watt's steam engine played a critical role in moving society from an agricultural to industrial-based economy. Watt's legacy also includes the use of horsepower and watts as units of measure.
What were the Camp David Accords?
Camp David Accords is the popular name for a 1979 peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. The name stuck since President Jimmy Carter, 1924, met with Israel's Menachem Begin. 1913 to 1992, and Egypt's Anwar Sadat, 1918 to 1981, at the presidential retreat at Camp David, Maryland. The treaty was actually signed on March 26, 1979, in Washington, D.C. with Carter as a witness to the agreement between the warring Middle Eastern nations. The pact, which was denounced by Arab countries, provided for the return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. The mountainous area, adjacent to Israel and at the north end of the Red Sea, had been the site of a major campaign during the Arab-Israeli War of 1967 and had been occupied by Israel since. The transfer of the peninsula back to Egypt was completed in 1982. The Camp David Accords had also outlined that the two sides would negotiate Palestinian autonomy in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. However, Sadat was assassinated in 1981. And this initiative saw no progress as a result of the Camp David Accords.
What was the Brumaire coup d'état?
It was the overthrow on November 9, 1799, of the French revolutionary government. The coup put Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, in power as one of three councils intended to head the government. While Napoleon was in Egypt and Syria waging what were for the most part successful military campaigns on behalf of the French government, there was growing discontent back home with the Directory. The group of 5 men who had governed France since 1795. His army stranded in the Middle East. Napoleon received word that France might soon be under attack by the Second Coalition. The second in a series of 6 alliances that formed in Europe in order to stave off French domination. Leaving another man in command of his troops, Napoleon hurried home where he was welcomed as a hero. Aided by his brother, Lucien Bonaparte, 1775–1840, and the French revolutionary leader Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, 1748–1836, Napoleon carried out a coup d'état, overthrowing the Directory. A consulate was formed, with the young Napoleon becoming first consul. The other councils had little influence, acting primarily as advisors to the ambitious Napoleon. The coup marked the end of the French Revolution, after the chaos and violence of the previous decade. The French people looked to Napoleon as a strong leader who could bring order to the country. They did not know that the 30-year-old possessed a seemingly insatiable hunger for power, which would soon transform the government into a dictatorship. After a brief peace, Napoleon declared himself Emperor of France on December 2, 1804. By which time he had already begun to wage a series of wars to gain himself more power in Europe.
What is the International Space Station?
It is a scientific laboratory orbiting about 250 statute miles above Earth. The International Space Station, ISS, is a cooperative project among 16 nations. Led by the United States, the other partners in what is called the most complex science project in history are Russia, Canada, Japan, the 11 nations of the European Space Agency, and Brazil. When completed, the ISS will have a mass of about 1,040,000 pounds. Will measure 356 feet across and 290 feet long. And will have almost an acre of solar panels to provide electrical power to 6 state-of-the-art laboratories. The ISS was built through a series of missions, the first of which was the U.S. designed. Russian-built space module Zarya, Sunrise, launched November 20, 1998. The original plan called for completion of the ISS in 2004, but construction was extended into 2006. As of April 30, 2005, the ISS had been in orbit. And a work in progress, for 2,353 days, with a cumulative crew time in space of 1,640 days. At that time, the United States had sent 11 expeditions to the islands. It then measured 240 feet across and 146 feet long, and weighed just more than 404,000 pounds. Scientists believe that experiments conducted on the ISS will lead to discoveries in medicine and to the development of materials and new science that will benefit people around the world. The space station is also considered a monumental first step in preparing for future human space exploration. Observers can track the ISS in orbit by using tools at NASA's website, http://spaceflight.nasa.gov/realdata/tracking/index.html. Construction updates and a timeline can be found at the Discovery Channel website. http://www.discovery.com/storiescience/ISS/ISS-HTML.
Why is the Iliad studied today?
Greek poet Homer's, c. 850 BC. Iliad and Odyssey, both works credited to him, are considered to be among the greatest works of literature and have had a profound influence on Western poetry, serving as the primary models for subsequent works, including the Aeneid, Virgil, and the Divine Comedy, Dante. The Iliad in particular can be seen as both the beginning of Western literature as we know it, and the culmination of a long tradition of oral epic poetry that may date as far back as the 13th century BC. The Iliad has been a part of Western education for nearly 3,000 years. The epic poem, telling the story of a 10-year Trojan War, reveals the author's keen understanding of human nature.
What happened in Granada?
On October 24, 1983, about 3,000 U.S. Marines and U.S. Army Rangers landed on the Caribbean island. The number included about 300 military personnel from neighboring Antigua, Barbados, Dominica, Jamaica, St. Kitts Nevis, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent. The arrival followed the October 12 through 19 coup in which Prime Minister Maurice Bishop, 1943 to 1983. Was overthrown and killed by a hardline Marxist military council headed by General Hudson Austin. While the United Nations and Friends of the United States condemned President Ronald Reagan. 1911 to 2004, for the action, American troops detained General Austin and restored order on the island. Governor-General Sir Paul Scoon, 1935, formed an interim government to prepare for elections. Most of the U.S. military presence was withdrawn by December 1983, with nominal forces remaining on the island through most of 1985. President Reagan justified the tactic by citing that the coup had put in danger American students on the island. But prevailing political conditions on tiny Grenada were more likely to have inspired the show of force. Increasingly stronger ties between Grenada and Cuba had made many American officials nervous. They feared the island would be used as a way station for shipping Soviet and Cuban arms to Central America.
When did the U.S. labor movement begin?
It began in the early 1800s, when skilled workers, such as carpenters and blacksmiths, banded together in local organizations with the goal of securing better wages. By the time fighting broke out in the Civil War, 1861 to 65, the first national unions had been founded again, by skilled workers. However, many of these early labor organizations struggled to gain widespread support and soon fell apart. But by the end of the century, several national unions, including the United Mine Workers, 1890, and the American Railway Union, 1893, emerged. In the last 2 decades of the 1800s, violence accompanied labor protests and strikes while opposition to the unions mounted. Companies shared blacklists of the names of workers suspected of union activities, hired armed guards to forcibly break strikes, and retained lawyers to successfully invoke the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, to crush strikes. Lawyers argued that strikes interfered with interstate commerce, which was declared illegal by the Sherman legislation, which had not been the intent of the lawmakers. In the early decades of the 1900s, unions made advances. But many Americans continued to view organizers and members as radicals. The climate changed for the unions during the Great Depression, 1929 to 39. With so many Americans out of work, many blamed business leaders for the economy's failure and began to view the unions in a new light as organizations to protect the interests of workers. In 1935, the federal government strengthened the union's cause in passing the National Labor Relations Act, also called the Wagner Act, protecting the rights to organize and to bargain collectively. When worker representatives, usually labor union representatives, negotiate with employers, the legislation also set up the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, which still works today to penalize companies that engage in unfair labor practices. The constitutionality of the act was challenged in court in 1937. But the Supreme Court upheld the legislation. The unions grew increasingly powerful over the next decade. By 1945, more than one-third of all non-agricultural workers belonged to a union. Having made important gains during World War II, 1939–45, including hospital insurance coverage, paid vacations and holidays, and pensions, union leaders continued to urge workers to strike to gain more ground. Something leaders felt was the workers' right amidst the unprecedented prosperity of the post-war era. But strikes soon impacted the life of the average American. Consumers faulted the unions for shortages of consumer goods, suspension of services, and inflated prices. Congress responded by passing the Labor Management Relations Act, or the Taft-Hartley Act, in 1947, which limits the impact of unions by prohibiting certain kinds of strikes, setting rules for how unions could organize workers, and establishing guidelines for how strikes that may impact the nation's health or safety are to be handled.
Who was Pythagoras?
Known by students today for the Pythagorean theorem, the square of the length of the hypotenuse of a right triangle is equal to the sum of the squares of the lengths of the other two sides. Pythagoras, c. 580 c. 500 BC, was a Greek philosopher and mathematician who lived in the 6th century BC and whose followers kept Pythagoreanism alive into the middle of the 4th century BC. Religious in nature, some have referred to the society as a cult. Pythagoreans believed in the functional and even mystical significance of numbers and made considerable advances in mathematics and astronomy. Pythagoras left no writings, which has prompted some scholars to believe that no such person ever existed, but rather, any doctrines ascribed to him are actually attributable to a group of people. Whatever the case, the Pythagorean legacy is real. It includes the word calculus. Pythagoreans used lines, triangles, and squares made of pebbles to represent numbers. The Latin word for pebble is calculus, the rendering of astronomy and music in numerical patterns, which were studied as mathematical subjects, and the first suggestion, as early as the 6th century BC, that Earth is spherical, not flat, and that Earth, the Moon, and the planets revolve around the Sun.
How were Southern blacks prevented from voting?
Besides intimidation, there were 3 different methods used in Southern states in the early part of the century to disenfranchise black citizens: 1. The poll tax, 2. Literacy tests, and 3. Grandfather clauses. The poll tax required a voter to pay a fee in order to exercise the right to vote. Literacy tests were implemented as a prerequisite for voting. This method also kept many poorly educated whites, unable to pass the exam, from casting their ballots as well. Most southern states also adopted legislation by which voting rights were extended only to those citizens who had been able to vote as of a certain date, a date when few if any black men would have been able to vote. Since these laws made provisions for said voters' descendants as well, they were dubbed grandfather clauses. Such attempts to deny citizens the right to vote were made unlawful in 1964, by the 24th Amendment, which outlaws the poll tax in all federal elections and primaries. In 1965, by the Voting Rights Act, which outlawed measures used to suppress minority votes. And in 1966, when poll taxes at the state and local levels were also declared illegal. Literacy tests and grandfather clauses were also struck down as unconstitutional.
How old is the oldest clock?
The first mechanical timekeeping device was a water clock called a clepsydra, which was used from about 1500 B. C through the Middle Ages, 500-1350. One very elaborate clepsydra was constructed for Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne, 742-814, in a D800, upon the hour, it dropped a metal ball into a bowl. Because of problems with water, it evaporated, froze, and eroded the surfaces of its container. A more accurate device was needed. It is believed that the first completely mechanical clock was developed by a monk around 1275. The clock was driven by the slow pull of a falling weight that had to be reset to its starting position after several hours. The clocks in monasteries were among the first to be fitted as alarm clocks. Striking mechanisms were added to the timekeeping devices so the monks would know when to ring the monastery bell. Other calendars remain in use in the world today, including the lunar Babylonian, Chinese, and Muslim calendars, the Jewish calendar, which is a combination of solar and lunar, and the solar Coptic, Japanese, and Hindu calendars. Secular calendars include the Julian day, used by astronomers, and the perpetual calendar, which gives the days of the week for the Julian and the Gregorian calendar, and therefore is used by historians and other scholars to reconcile world events along a single timeline.
What happened at Anzio?
Anzio, Italy, was the site of a 4-month battle between Allied troops and the Germans during World War II, 1939-45. On January 22, 1944, more than 36,000 Allied troops and thousands of vehicles made an amphibious landing at Anzio, which is situated on a peninsula jutting into the Tyrrhenian Sea. But German soldiers, led by Field Marshal Albert Kesserling, 1885-1960, were able to surround the Allied forces, containing them along the shoreline into May of that year. Fighting was intense, with an estimated 60,000 casualties, about half on each side. On May 25, 1944, the Germans withdrew in defeat, enabling the Allies to march toward Rome, 33 miles to the north-northwest. The taking of Anzio was a tactical surprise on the part of the US and British, and their eventual victory there was a turning point for the Allies in the war.
Why did NATO respond to the 9/11 attacks?
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, responded to the terrorist attacks on the United States, because its charter states that an attack on any member nation is considered an attack on the alliance. The language is contained in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, signed April 4, 1949, in Washington, D.C. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense, will assist the party or parties so attacked. It was the first time Article 5 had been invoked by NATO since its founding. On September 12, 2001, NATO convened a special meeting in response to the attacks on American soil and afterward issued a statement saying, in part, that the United States could rely on the support and assistance of NATO if it was found that the attack was directed from abroad. The organization's Secretary General, Lord Robertson, 1946, strongly condemned the attacks and called for the international community and the members of the alliance to unite their forces in fighting the scourge of terrorism. The invocation of Article 5 was confirmed by NATO on October 2, after U.S. Ambassador-at-Large Frank Taylor briefed the organization's chief decision-making body on the investigations into the terrorist attacks. The North Atlantic Council determined that the information provided by Taylor confirmed that the individuals who carried out the attacks belonged to the worldwide terrorist network of Al-Qaeda, headed by Osama bin Laden and protected by the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. At a press conference held October 8, Secretary General Lord Robertson announced NATO's full support for the U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan. The following day it was confirmed that NATO assets had been deployed to the eastern Mediterranean to establish a presence in the region. But the alliance did not take a lead role in the military effort to oust the Taliban from Afghanistan.
Was the Holocaust directed by the German government?
Yes. When fervent nationalist Adolf Hitler, 1889–1945, rose to power in Germany in 1933, he quickly established a reign of terror based on his philosophy that the German, Aryan, race is superior to all others. He established a violent policy against Jews, those who did not flee the country. were rounded up and sent to concentration camps, where they were kept without cause. This was before Hitler's acts of military aggression in Europe. But after German troops invaded Poland and World War II began, the Führer's anti-Semitic campaign was accelerated. Jews in Germany and in Nazi-occupied countries of Europe were severely persecuted. Those who were put into concentration camps including Auschwitz, Treblinka, Buchenwald, and Dachau were exterminated, many of them in gas chambers. By the end of the war, in 1945, Hitler's final solution to the Jewish question had been underway for some 12 years. And 6 million Jews had been systematically murdered by the Nazis during the Holocaust, or Shoah, Hebrew. As his defeat was imminent, the despotic ruler took his own life in 1945. By then he had destroyed Europe's Jewish community. Many of Hitler's leaders were later tried by an international court at Nuremberg.
What is mercantilism?
An economic system that developed as feudalism was dissolving, at the end of the Middle Ages 500-1350. Mercantilism advocates strict government control of the national economy. Its adherents believe a healthy economy can only be achieved through state regulation. The goals were to accumulate bullion, gold or silver bars, establish a favorable balance of trade with other countries, develop the nation's agricultural concerns, as well as its manufacturing concerns, and establish foreign trading policies.
What is the incidence of conflict in Africa?
Since the end of World War II, 1939-45, there have been at least 56 separate identifiable conflicts in Africa, with about a dozen of them ongoing in 2005. The continent seemed to be in a state of turmoil, with conflicts ranging from regional skirmishes between warlords to civil war. The unimaginable horrors of the Rwandan genocide, 1994, the decades-old civil unrest and ethnic cleansing in Sudan, and long-standing rebel violence in Uganda made news the world over. The war-ravaged image of Africa caused many observers to wonder if the continent was unusually prone to civil war. In a study published by the World Bank, researchers concluded in 2000 that Africa has had a similar incidence of civil conflict to that of other developing regions, and that, with minor exceptions, its conflicts are consistent with the global pattern. The authors of that report acknowledged that the rising trend of conflict in Africa was due to its atypically poor economic performance. While many could see only Africa as war-torn, others pointed to the fact that most of Africa's nations were peaceful, and that the trouble spots gave the international community an overstated impression of despair on the continent.
Who were the leaders of abolition?
Leaders of the anti-slavery movement included journalist William Lloyd Garrison, 1805 to 1879. Founder of the influential anti-slavery journal The Liberator and of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Established 1833, brothers Arthur, 1786 to 1865, and Lewis, 1788 to 1873, Tappan. Prominent New York merchants who were also founders of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and Theodore Dwight Weld. 1803 to 1895, leader of student protests, organizer of the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. And author of the Bible Against Slavery, 1837, and other abolitionist works. Underground Railroad conductor Harriet Tubman, c. 1820 to 1913, worked against slavery by helping to free hundreds of blacks who escaped slavery in the South. Heading for northern states and Canada. Writers such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, 1811-1896, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1851-52. Helped strengthen the abolitionist cause and were instrumental in swaying public sentiment. In the hands of some activists, the movement became violent. In 1859, ardent abolitionist John Brown, 1800 to 1859, led a raid on the armory at Harper's Ferry, in present-day West Virginia, which proved a failed attempt to emancipate slaves by force.
So much art is called impressionistic today. What exactly is impressionism?
The term Impressionism was derived by a rather mean-spirited art critic from the title of one of Claude Monet's 1840 to 1926, early paintings, Impression, Fog, La Havre, 1872. The French Impressionist painters were interested in the experience of the natural world and in rendering it exactly as it is seen, not fixed and frozen with an absolute perspective, but rather as constantly changing and as it is glimpsed by a moving eye. Georges Seurat, 1859 to 1891, and Paul Signac, 1863 to 1935, are also typically thought of as Impressionists. However, they are more appropriately dubbed Neo-Impressionists since they, along with Camille Pissarro, 1830 to 1903, advanced the work of the original group through more scientific theories of light and color, introducing deliberate optical effects to their works. Seurat and Signac are commonly referred to as pointillists for the technique pioneered by Seurat, of using small brush strokes to create an intricate mosaic effect. The Post-Impressionists, artists representing a range of explorations but all having come out of the Impressionist movement, included both Seurat and Signac, as well as Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. 1864 to 1901, Paul Gauguin, 1848 to 1903, Vincent van Gogh, 1853 to 1890. And Paul Cézanne, 1839 to 1906, who was also associated with the original Impressionists. Together the Impressionists paved the way for the art of the 20th century. Since as a group they asserted the identity of a painting as a thing, a created object in its own right, with its own structure and its own laws beyond and different from the world of man and nature, history of modern art.
Who was the first physician in history?
The first physician known by name was Imhotep, an Egyptian who lived about 2600 B. C. Also considered a sage, Imhotep lived at a time when the Egyptians were making progress in medicine. The advances included a textbook on the treatment of wounds, broken bones, and even tumors. Imhotep was later worshipped as a god by the Egyptians.
What happened on Iwo Jima?
During the month of February 1945, Allied forces and the Japanese fought for control of Iwo Jima, a small island in the northwest Pacific Ocean, 759 miles south of Tokyo. Japan was using Iwo Jima as a base from which to launch air attacks on U.S. bombers in the Pacific. Capturing the island from the Japanese became a key objective for the United States. On February 19, 1945, the 4th and 5th U.S. Marine Divisions invaded the island. Fighting over the next several days claimed more than 6,000 U.S. troops. On the morning of February 23, after a rigorous climb to the top of Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima's 550-foot inactive volcano, U.S. Marines planted an American flag. Though small, it was visible from around the island. Later that day, a larger flag was raised atop Mount Suribachi by 5 Marines and a Navy hospital corpsman. The moment was captured by American news photographer Joe Rosenthal. His famous photo became the inspiration for the U.S. Marine Corps Memorial, dedicated November 10, 1954, in Arlington, Virginia.
What were the Swedish colonial holdings?
The Swedish possessions consisted of a small colony called New Sweden, established in 1638 at Fort Christina, present-day Wilmington, Delaware. The Swedes gradually extended the settlement from the mouth of the Delaware Bay, south of Wilmington, northward along the Delaware River as far as present-day Trenton, New Jersey. The settlers were mostly fur traders, though there was farming in the colony as well. In 1655 the territory was taken by the Dutch in a military expedition led by Director-General of New Netherlands Peter Stuyvesant, c. 1610–1672. For 9 years the territory was part of the Dutch colonial claims called New Netherlands. In 1664 the English claimed it and the rest of New Netherlands. Delaware was set up as a British proprietary colony, which it remained until the outbreak of the American Revolution, 1775–83. New Sweden was the only Swedish colony in the Americas.
Did Newton really formulate the laws of motion after observing an apple falling from a tree?
While it may sound more like legend than fact, Newton maintained that it was true. In 1665, Sir Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, who was newly graduated from Cambridge University, escaped bubonic-plagued London and was visiting the family farm. There he saw an apple fall to the ground, and he began considering the force that was responsible for the action. He theorized that the apple had fallen because all matter attracts other matter, that the rate of the apple's fall was directly proportional to the attractive force that Earth exerted upon it, and that the force that pulled the apple was also responsible for keeping the moon in orbit around Earth. But he then set aside these theories and turned his attention to experimenting with light. In the 1680s, Newton revisited the matter of the apple, taking into consideration Galileo's 1564 to 1642 studies of motion, 1602-09. From which the Italian scientist had concluded that falling objects accelerate at a constant rate. In 1687, Newton, with the considerable support of his friend Edmund Halley, of Halley's comet fame, published Principia Mathematica, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, which outlined the laws of gravity and planetary motion. Newton arranged Galileo's findings into three basic laws of motion. 1. A body, any object or matter in the universe, that is at rest tends to remain at rest, and a body in motion tends to remain in motion, moving in the same direction, unless acted upon by an outside force. This is the law of inertia. 2. The force to move a body is equal to its mass times acceleration, F equals ma, where F is force, m is mass, and a is acceleration. And 3. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. These three laws allowed Newton to calculate the gravitational force between Earth and the Moon.
Why is stem cell research controversial?
Stem cell research raises important bioethical issues. Stem cells have the potential to develop into all body tissues, and they may be able to replace diseased or defective human tissue. The best source for these cell clusters is human embryos, which are destroyed when the stem cells are extracted. Opponents to the research, including any on the religious right who also oppose abortion, argue that the embryo is a potential human life and therefore should not be destroyed for the sake of science. But proponents of the controversial research say that a variety of treatments and cures for diseases could be gained through scientific advancements made because of stem cell research. Supporters add that the embryos cannot develop on their own, and therefore should be put to use for the sake of better medicine, which could help people who suffer from many different diseases, including diabetes, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's, thus improving and extending human life. It is important to note that the embryos exist in laboratories because of advances previously made in reproductive science. In August 2001, the George W. Bush administration moved cautiously forward on the issue by allowing stem cell research as long as it is limited to existing cells, the embryos having already been destroyed. In other words, new stem cells cannot be created strictly for the purpose of laboratory work. Bush said he concluded that federal funding should be used to support research on 60 existing genetically diverse stem cell lines, which have the ability to regenerate themselves indefinitely. The president acknowledged the complexity of the issue, saying in a radio address, "At its core, this issue forces us to confront fundamental questions about the beginnings of life and the ends of science. It lies at a difficult moral intersection, juxtaposing the need to protect life in all its phases with the prospect of saving and improving life in all its stages. But," he added, "for the existing stem cell lines, the life and death decision has already been made." Over the next few years, state legislatures took up the issue, creating a patchwork of policies across the nation. By 2005.